Tonight's talk is actually derived from a book that I've been working on entitled The First Word on the Existence of God, and it's for a small Orthodox press called St Sergius Press. And this is part of a series of short little books that introduce a whole range of topics. And so I really encourage you to take a look at that series as more of them are being published. There's some far better scholars than I that are contributing, and they're just great, accessible books if you're interested in learning more about theology and church history from an Orthodox perspective. Tonight's talk is called Orthodoxy and the Existence of God. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at two different conceptual models of God, and then we're going to look specifically at an Orthodox conception of God. And then we're going to explore some contemporary arguments for atheism. Now, unfortunately, because of the constraints of time, I'm not going to actually, despite what Father Nicholas said, I won't be giving you an argument for God's existence. But what I will be doing is exploring the concept of God and exploring the kind of contemporary debate over the existence of God that's taking place at an academic level. Hopefully, I will be able to present it in a way that it's accessible for everybody. Let's look at the two different models of God. The first model, we'll call it the being among beings model, or BAB for short. To get your head around this, let's look at this quote from Professor Richard Swinburne. You might be familiar with him. He's a Christian philosopher at the University of Oxford, and he actually is an Orthodox Christian. He converted later in life. But his model of God, as we're going to see, that he's spent most of his academic career writing about, actually isn't an Orthodox model of God. But we'll get to that. This is how he defines God. I take the proposition God exists and the equivalent proposition there is a God to be logically equivalent to there exists necessarily a person without a body, a spirit, who necessarily is eternal, perfectly free, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and the creator of all things. I use God as the name of the person picked out by this description. Does this sound like a concept of God that you are familiar with? Any of you think of God in this way? Maybe not with some of these fancy terms like necessarily and omnipotent, omniscient, but thinking about God as a person who's invisible, who has all the power, all the knowledge, he's the perfectly good. Is that a way that you've ever conceived of God? Anybody? You don't have to be shy, you can talk. Yeah, that's pretty common, I think. In fact, if you walked out on the street and talked to anybody and just said, hey, what do we mean when we say God? They're probably going to think of God in this kind of way. Here are some of the features of the being among beings model. God is a person in the same sense that you and I are persons, only lacking a physical body. So when we use that word person, we mean person in the same sense as we do when we talk about you and I. Only we mean God doesn't have a physical body. And on this view too, God has properties or character traits, attributes, just like you and I, such as knowledge and goodness, only he has these attributes to a maximal degree. We only have them to a minimal degree. I have a little bit of knowledge, but compared to God, he has all the knowledge. So in other words, according to this view, there's only a quantitative difference between God and other existing things. For unlike you and I, or any other thing in the world, God is omnipotent, that means all-powerful, omniscient, which means all-knowledgeable, and omnibenevolent, perfectly good. We can imagine these three omni-properties as existing on a sliding scale, with different things in the world possessing different amounts of knowledge, power, and goodness. So I've created a fancy chart here. On this chart, I've picked out three things. One is a dog, humans, and God. This is kind of, I've made up the numbers here, okay? This is fictional numbers, but this is just meant as a visual representation to help get your mind and help you wrap your head around what I'm talking about. So according to this view that we're discussing, the being among beings model, we can think of God as just having this maximal amount. So on this scale, 30 is the maximal, right? I just arbitrarily picked that number. And that's as much knowledge, as much power, as much goodness as you can have. You can see on this, God wins on all those fronts, right? Human beings have some knowledge, have some power. I actually put dogs a little higher on this chart because, human beings can be pretty terrible to each other. So, my dog is pretty nice. All right, so hopefully that helps you visualize kind of what I'm talking about here. Proponents of this model of God take these three omni-properties I've been talking about as constituting God's essence. And that's just a fancy term that philosophers use to mean what type of thing something is. When we talk about an essence, it's what something is. So when we say that these omni-properties constitute God's essence, what we mean is that they are describing what type of thing God is, defining God. Or if you want to use the word classifying God, putting him into a class of things. Now, on this model, God is the only person that stands in this class. He is the single most knowledgeable, powerful, and perfect thing in the world, but nevertheless, he is but one great thing in a world full of many lesser things. Another way to think about this is God sits at the top of a single continuous chain of being and is a member of this total set of existing things that we call the world. We can visualize that like this. So everything in the circle, which is a solid line, that's important, is the world. So I didn't have enough space to try to include every actual thing that's in the world. So I stopped at animals there, but that's not because I think animals are the most fundamental things in the world. But you can kind of imagine this chain just potentially infinitely going down, so you get into smaller and smaller things, down to like fundamental particles, all the stuff in the world. But God's at the very top of this chain of being. But God is a part of the world, according to this model. So when we think about the world, we think about all the things that exist. God's at the top, according to this model, but he's within that circle. All of these circles have solid lines. That means that they are the type of things that potentially we can grasp, we can define. And ancient philosophers use the term circumscribe. We can circumscribe it with our thoughts. We can think about them and come to know what kind of things they are. And on this model, God is a part of that. We can define God, we can give God's essential attributes, we can fully grasp God, or at least we can grasp a lot of God's properties and characteristics. All right, now at a popular level, this Bab conception of God is often extremely anthropomorphized. So conceived as having many more human-like properties, such as being angry, being vengeful, or on the opposite extreme as being one's homie, or being one's supplier of private aeroplanes. This is the type of conception of God, especially that's criticized in the public square, and by such renowned figures as Professor Richard Dawkins, another professor from Oxford, who you may have heard of. He's not as popular now, but like 15, 20 years ago, he was always on TV because of his book, The God Delusion, and he was always doing interviews and giving lectures. He's a biologist from Oxford who's a talented writer, very witty, really funny. And this is a quote from his book, The God Delusion, and he's just critiquing the concept of God. And what he's really critiquing is this type of being among beings view that I've been describing to you, but the highly anthropomorphized version of it. So the kind of view that probably, again, if you just go out in the street and start asking people about God, the kind of view of God that a lot of people have, kind of like Monty Python in The Search for the Holy Grail, the giant head that you see over Camelot, talking and telling King Arthur about his quest, sending him on the quest to go search for the Holy Grail. This is the type of God that people like Richard Dawkins are kind of setting their sights on and critiquing. And this is a quote from his book. He says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal," I am going to mess up this one, "sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." That's a mouthful. I've seen him say that from memory in an interview. That's pretty impressive to me. But not a very nice thing to say. Some pretty heavy, harsh words there. But this is the type of picture of God that he's critiquing, that I've been talking about. Some proponents of this being among beings view also treat God like a scientific hypothesis, competing against other hypotheses to provide an explanation for some highly specific natural phenomena. And there's some popular level type of arguments you see on YouTube all the time. For example, God is sometimes appealed to as the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe's physical constants, or as the cause of the Big Bang. Many cosmologists, however, believe that some prior physical state brought about the Big Bang, and that something like a multiverse theory best explains the fine-tuning of the physical constants for the advent of intelligent life. So what you have here is God being pitted against scientific theories. You have a theory about the origin of the universe, a model, a Big Bang cosmology, and then you have some theists saying, yeah, and God explains how that happened. God's the cause of the Big Bang. But you have scientists and cosmologists working on that going, no, that's not true. Our model's wrong. Our model is incomplete. We have to keep working on the model. There's actually going to be some other physical state that explains the Big Bang. And so what you do is you have this debate where you have God being treated like a hypothesis to explain something against some other scientific hypothesis. Well, treating God like a scientific hypothesis has opened up theists to the charge that they are committing the God of the gaps fallacy. This fallacy of reasoning is committed when one simply plugs God in as an explanation for any natural phenomenon that science currently does not understand. Well, the problem with this is that science is really good at figuring stuff out. So eventually, stuff that we maybe didn't understand well, that we just kind of say, it must be God. God did it. Well, you give scientists enough time, they're going to figure that out and come up with a physical, natural cause for that, an explanation, a scientific one. And so this is the type of dialectic that you see all the time in the public square. I see this with popular level Christian apologists on YouTube and TikTok. I see this even at universities and debates, public debates that take place. God is thought of as essentially an invisible person with maximal power, maximal amount of knowledge, the most perfect, best good person who ever existed. Maybe he's even really highly anthropomorphized in this kind of way. God is, like a Zeus type figure who gets angry sometimes and smashes around and throws lightning bolts, or maybe he's like, you're really cool, he's your best friend and he's going to give you whatever you want. He's thought of as a type of scientific hypothesis to explain something. These are common views, all associated to this model of God that I've been describing. Does this all sound familiar to people? Like, you've encountered this before? Some of it? Okay. I hope so. Even if you're not actively someone who's interested in reading about philosophy or science or something, you might have just encountered this in the media somehow. All right. Well, that's the first model of God. I want to look at a second conceptual model. We're going to call this the Beyond Being model, or BB for short. This is a quote from St. John of Damascus from his book. It's actually a collection of 3 books, The Fountain of Knowledge. He says this: God does not belong to the number of beings or of existing things, not because he does not exist, but because he transcends all beings and being itself. Let's try to think about that a bit more. On this model of God, which is a model of God that's the most common one. I'd say there's a standard way of conceptualizing God in the Orthodox tradition. The term God is not a proper noun. So if you might have noticed with that last conception of God, the word God is treated like a name, right? It's like a proper noun that's describing a person, like, hey, this is my friend God. In the same way I might say, this is my friend Athanasius or Elizabeth. But in the Orthodox tradition, and according to this beyond being model, God is neither a proper noun, like the name Athanasius or Elizabeth, nor a natural kind term like human being, dog, tree. Natural kind terms are picking out a class of thing, a type of thing. So when I say dog, you immediately start thinking about all the different types of dogs you've experienced, the things that fall into that category. These are circumscribable things that you can define and put into a box. Rather, the term God is taken to be an agent noun, like words like painter or gardener or designer. But specifically, when the word God is used, it's referring to that which explains the existence of all things, that which engages in the act of grounding the world's existence, the Creator. Now, as Creator, God stands outside the world and that chain of being that we were looking at. He is not taken to be one existing thing amongst others, but rather God is said to be beyond being. And since God is beyond being, it is also believed that God is ontologically infinite. That's another big fancy philosophical term, but what it means is that God doesn't possess a form or structure. He's not a finite thing. Think about that image of everything in the circle, everything that's circumscribable, limited. Once you describe me as a human being, that comes with a set of limitations, right? There's a limit to the range of things I'm capable of. I'm defined. We can debate about that definition, but we can, probably agree that, well, I'm like an animal because I have a physical body and organs and I breathe like other animals. And maybe if you want to go with Aristotle, we might point to, but unlike other animals, I'm rational, so I can ask questions like, does God exist and what's right and wrong, those kind of things. So if we want to take that as a rough and ready definition of what it is to be a human being, now what we're doing is we're showing I'm limited. I'm not like a tree. I can't feed myself by taking energy from the sun. Unfortunately, I don't work that way, but plants can. And as much as I would love to just jump up in the air and start flying like Superman, that'd be really cool, I can't do that. There's a limit. So something that is ontologically infinite, though, doesn't have that limit. It doesn't have a type or class that it belongs to. It's not a genus or class of thing, and so it doesn't possess an essence in the same way that a finite, determinate thing, like human beings, dogs, and trees do. And because of this, Orthodox Christians believe that it is impossible to know what kind of thing God is. They take God's essence to be unknowable or ineffable. That's a term that you read theologians use all the time, Orthodox ones. So here's a way we can conceptualize this model that I'm talking about, the beyond being model. Notice the differences between the last model. In this model, the world is actually in the circle. So this is the world. This is the world of things. If you want to use the old philosophical term that Aristotle used, this is the world of substances, individual things. And they're all encompassed by solid lines. And that's just to symbolize that they're all finite. They're all determinate things, things that we can define, circumscribable things. And I put the word God outside of that. And I put a dotted line just to symbolize that God isn't circumscribable. God isn't determinate. Whatever God is beyond our ability to grasp on this model. But also notice that everything is encompassed by God. Everything is in God. All right, so let's now go, that was a more generic kind of model, but now let's let's take this closer to home and really try to enrich that by looking at some Orthodox Christian sources. This is a quote from the Wisdom of Solomon. It says, "The whole world before thee is like a speck that tips the scales, and like a drop of morning dew that falls upon the ground. For thou lovest all things that exist, and hast loathing for none of the things which thou hast made, for thou wouldest not have made anything if thou hadst hated it. How would anything have endured if thou hadst not willed it? Or how would anything not called forth by thee have been preserved? Thou sparest all things, for they are thine. O Lord, who lovest the living, for thy immortal spirit is in all things." Here's some passages from St. Paul. So this is the account from the book of Acts, where St. Paul's actually giving a talk, a better talk than I am, more eloquent one, to a group of philosophers. And this is part of that speech he gave. He says, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all men life and breath and everything. And he made from one every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel after him and find him. For he is not far off from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being." And then in Romans, St. Paul says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made." That term, invisible nature, is key there. Now, kind of moving, a huge time jump here, to Pseudo-Dionysius, who says, and I can't emphasize how influential his theology is to Orthodox thinking. He says, "Just as the senses can neither grasp nor perceive the things of the mind, just as representation and shape cannot take in the simple and the shapeless, just as corporal form cannot lay hold of the intangible and incorporeal, by the same standard of truth, beings are surpassed by the infinity beyond being, intelligences by that oneness which is beyond intelligence. Indeed, the inscrutable one, God, is out of reach of every rational process, nor can any words come up to the inexpressible good. This one, this source of all unity, this supra-existent being. Mind beyond mind, word beyond speech, it is gathered up by no discourse, by no intuition, by no name. It is, and it is as no other being is, the cause or explanation of all existence, and therefore itself transcending existence. It alone could give an authoritative account of what it really is." And finally, here's a passage from St. Maximus the Confessor. And even though it feels like I've been quoting a lot, this is just like scratching the tip of the iceberg with what we could be looking at in terms of the patristic sources talking about the subject. "God, who is truly none of the things that exist, and who, properly speaking, is all things, and at the same time beyond them, is present in the logos of each thing in itself, and in all the logoi, together according to which all things exist. God is whole in all things commonly, and in each being particularly, without separation or being subject to division. But on the contrary, is truly all things in all, never going out of his own indivisible simplicity." We could spend a lot of time unpacking that. I know it's got some potentially confusing language because he's using some categories that we don't normally use. But really just focus on the opening part there where he's talking about God being none of the things. He's not in that circle, that's the world. But all things are in God. So there's this sense of God's radical transcendence that's beyond being view, but also radical immanence, the closeness, nearness of God. All things are in God. Like St. Paul says, in him we live and move and have our being. There would be no being, there would be no things without God. Yet God isn't one of those things. So let's kind of summarize what we've been talking about with this Orthodox conception of God, this being beyond being view. Again, the term God is an agent noun referring to that which explains the existence of all things. God is taken to be transcendent or beyond being, which is to say God is not a substance or a thing, but rather the source of all things, yet simultaneously immanent or close, pervading all things. For all things are in God, and God is in all things. God, in some sense, contains the forms or ordering principles. That's those terms, logoi, we were talking about with St. Maximus. These forms or ordering principles that all ordered entities depend on for their discrete existence, and which make them understandable or intelligible or accessible to human knowledge. Yet God does not exemplify a form or structure, and thus his essence, what God is unknowable. God is ineffable. And finally, you might have noticed as I was reading a lot of those quotes, when we apply positive concepts to God, like that God has knowledge, that God has power, those kind of concepts. When we apply these kind of concepts to God, we don't do so in the same sense as when we apply these concepts to finite existing things. Rather, we either use analogical or metaphorical language. Think about the Psalms are filled with this type of language. God is a rock. Well, the psalmist is not actually claiming that God's a giant rock. We are underneath the shadow of his wings. Well, God's not saying, the psalmist is not saying God's a giant bird and that we're like sitting under his wings. These are metaphors. They are telling us something about what God's like, but they're not perfectly describing or capturing God. So the Bible's filled with rich metaphors, with analogical language. And all this theological language we use, it doesn't describe or capture God perfectly. Sometimes it even seems like we're using outright contradictory language. Maybe you might have noticed that at the very beginning, the quote from St. John of Damascus, where St. John is, on the one hand, he's saying, oh, God doesn't exist. I mean, he does exist, but he doesn't exist. I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of what he's saying. Like he doesn't exist in the same way that you and I exist or a tree exists. But he does exist, as in the sense that he's not imaginary, he's real. He's why there's anything at all. Okay, now that we've talked about these two models of God, that being among beings model and this beyond being model, now we can shift our focus onto contemporary arguments for atheism. So now we can try to maybe understand what's happening right now, especially not just at a popular level, but even at an academic level amongst professional philosophers who discuss these kind of things. Let's begin by asking, what do we mean by atheism? Sometimes that's not clear, especially because you can see a lot of conflicting information when you just start searching on the internet and looking at websites. Well, in the very early days of the church, you may be surprised to learn Orthodox Christians were actually accused of being atheists. That might sound weird. They were accused of this because they rejected the notion that the gods and goddesses of the Greek and Roman pantheons existed, and because they refused to acknowledge the divinity of Caesar. Now, most of us today are atheists in this sense. But there are some who take this position one step further, rejecting any form of polytheism or monotheism. Indeed, contemporary atheism just is the view that no gods of any type exist. Now, generally speaking, we can separate contemporary atheism into two categories, which I shall refer to as negative atheism and positive atheism. By negative atheism, I do not mean an atheist who is grumpy or pessimistic. A negative atheist believes there are no good reasons for believing that gods exist, yet refrains from offering positive arguments for atheism. So at a popular level, many negative atheists claim that the burden of proof lies squarely on the shoulders of theists. In other words, they don't think that they need to make any kind of positive case for atheism. Rather, they believe it is incumbent upon the theist to make a positive case for believing in the existence of God or gods. Now, they might critique, popular kind of arguments for God's existence, but they're not going to offer their own arguments for supporting the claim that God doesn't exist. So what's positive atheism then? Well, positive atheist is not necessarily someone who's upbeat, happy-go-lucky, or optimistic. They might be, but not necessarily. Rather, a positive atheist holds that there is no good evidence for the existence of gods, yet also attempts to show that the proposition it is not the case that gods exist is true. In other words, a positive atheist is one who makes positive arguments for atheism. So in this talk tonight, I'm going to focus my attention on positive atheism. Namely, I will evaluate some of the most assiduous arguments for atheism ever devised. And these are the arguments that serious academic philosophers debate, not the kind of emotionally charged diatribes and pithy quips or simplistic jabs made by Richard Dawkins and British comedians and dank memes that you see on the internet. So what I'm going to argue tonight is that virtually all contemporary arguments for atheism are unsound. In philosophy, when we talk about an argument being unsound, we just mean that there's at least one or more of the premises of the argument that is false, and therefore the argument doesn't support its conclusion. Whenever you make an argument, you're trying to give some kind of reasoning or evidence to support some contention or conclusion. And the argument we're thinking about tonight is the contention that God does not exist. So when I say that these arguments, these contemporary arguments for atheism are unsound, what I mean is they don't actually succeed at proving their conclusion. They fail at that. In that case, if I'm correct, if my ambitious claim is true, then it turns out that insofar as orthodoxy is concerned, there is not strong evidence or rational justification for atheism. So let's look at the general structure of the argument for atheism, the contemporary form of it. It goes like this. It's pretty simple at first, but as you see, it's going to get more complex. Premise 1, if God exists, he is a person who essentially possesses the omni properties simultaneously. You might just summarize premise 1 as, if God exists, the Bab conception of God, the Bab model, is true. Premise 2, it is not the case that any person possesses the omni properties simultaneously. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, premise 1 is actually not really debated very much, at least amongst philosophers of religion, surprisingly. A lot of philosophers of religion just kind of take that as a default premise. Oh yeah, that's what we mean by God. They kind of think like Richard Swinburne in that quote at the beginning. Swinburne is, he's not a nobody. He's an eminent scholar at Oxford. He's written a ton of books and articles on this subject and many others. And that's kind of his default mode. And so following his example, that's how the dialogue has gone with philosophers for the most part. That's changing a little bit now. So premise 1 is not really disputed. What everyone talks about is premise 2. But premise 1 is really just, again, what I said before, just kind of affirming the Bab model. So it just is assuming that if God exists, God is a person, just like you and I, only invisible. And that means God is a genus or class or type of thing that we can define, and it offers a definition. God is a person that has at least all three of those. Those are like the main kind of character traits, attributes of God, those omni properties. And again, just to remind you, what I mean is omniscience, God's all-knowing; omnipotence, God's all-powerful; omnibenevolence, God is perfectly good. And that's how they define God. So that's the start of the argument. Really then, where all of the debate has been and continues to be is with premise 2. Premise 2 is the crucial premise of the argument, because a lot of people just assume the first premise by default. Well, yeah, that's what we mean by God. Now, the second premise says it's not the case that any person possesses the omni properties simultaneously. Numerous sophisticated arguments have been developed by atheist philosophers to provide rational support or justification for premise 2. The literature on this subject is truly vast, and it would be impossible to survey all of it, I'd keep you here till next week, and you would all hate me, and you'd never invite me back again. It probably would take longer than that in reality to actually walk through and wade through all of what's been written on this. But generally speaking, the supporting arguments for premise 2 seek to do one of two things. First, they want to try to show that it's logically impossible for any person to possess the omniproperties simultaneously. They just want to say that's not possible. No person can have all three of those properties. Or second, they want to say, or that's a bit strong, the first one, but maybe the weaker goal is to just show that it's highly unlikely that a person who possesses the omniproperties simultaneously exists. So let's unpack this a bit. Now, like I said, the literature is vast. There's a ton of these type of arguments trying to accomplish those two general goals that I just outlined. Thankfully, my doctoral thesis supervisor, Yujin Nagasawa, he did the hard work of wading through all those and actually categorizing these into 3 groups. So that's really helpful for us tonight. So I'm going to call the first group type A arguments. These kind of arguments are trying to show that one of those omniproperties is incoherent, and thus that it is logically impossible for a person to possess it. A classic example is the paradox of the stone. Maybe you've encountered this before. Sometimes it's said more like a joke, but it's actually a serious philosophical argument. And there's been a lot of writing on it. This argument, the paradox of the stone, it targets the property of omnipotence. So it targets this essential property that God has of being all-powerful. It tries to show that the concept of omnipotence is just incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. It's contradictory. Kind of like the concept of a square circle. There can't be a square circle. That doesn't make any sense. That's a contradiction. And it just starts by asking a simple question. Can God create an unliftable stone? One that he couldn't even lift? Well, it doesn't take long for you to start thinking, wait a minute, if I answer yes, he can, well then there's something God can't do. He can't lift that stone. So then he's not omnipotent. If I say, no, he can't do that, he could lift any stone, well then there's something he can't do. He can't create an unliftable stone. That you can see where this is going. The point of this is to show that this is a kind of character trait nobody could have. It doesn't even make sense to talk about someone being all-powerful. All right, and why does this support premise 2? Well, it's showing that, hey, you can't have an all-powerful person. So if God is an all-powerful, all-knowledgeable, perfectly good being, well, we've just shown that you can't have an all-powerful being. So now we've just shown that God doesn't exist, right? You can't have a being like God. So it supports premise 2 in that way. Now, that's just one example. There's a load of those kind of arguments. I could fill a book just talking about those arguments. But there's another type of arguments. They're called type B arguments. Now, this is a little different. These kind of arguments try to show that at least 2 or more of these omniproperties are incompatible. They don't work together. And thus that it is not possible for a person to possess them simultaneously. A classic example of this is the argument from incompossibility. Now, this argument is going to target God's supposed omniscience and omnipotence. So his having this property of being all-knowledgeable and all-powerful. It's not going to try to show that any one of those is incoherent, but what this type of argument does, it tries to show that you can't have one person who has both of these properties. They're incompatible with each other. You can't have an all-knowledgeable person and someone who's all-powerful. And if they can do that, they've supported premise 2 of the argument. They've just shown you can't have a person that has, knowledge and all power. So you can't have God. God doesn't exist. Here's how this argument kind of goes. It starts off by saying, well, can an omnipotent God ever experience fear? Well, if not, he doesn't have a complete and comprehensive knowledge of fear. Thus, there is at least one thing that an omnipotent person doesn't know, namely, what it's like to be afraid. Thus, an omnipotent person can't simultaneously be omniscient at the same time. That's the rough sketch of the argument. So you can see that the idea is here, well, if you say God is a omnipotent person with all power and has all the knowledge, that doesn't work. Because if he has all the knowledge, that means he would have to know everything, comprehensive knowledge of everything. But we can think of things that an omnipotent person with all power wouldn't know. Presumably, if you have all the power, why would you ever be afraid? And if you can't ever experience fear, then you don't really have a comprehensive knowledge of fear, right? There's something you don't know, what it's like to be afraid. So you can't have a person who's got all knowledge, all power, so you can't have God. And that's just, again, that's one example of a type B argument. There's a lot of those kind of arguments out there. Okay, now we come to the type C arguments. These are like the ones that are the most influential and probably the most debated. These are a little different. They're not trying to show that more ambitious claim that it's just impossible for there to be a being like this bad model of God. Can't have a person that has all those properties. It's not trying to go that far. It's just trying to say it's really unlikely, really improbable that there's a being like that. And the classic example of this is the argument from evil, specifically what's called the evidential argument from evil. Now, this argument targets all three properties, all of these character traits of God: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. And it tries to show that some fact in the world, in this case, the existence of gratuitous, seemingly meaningless, pointless evils and suffering, makes it highly unlikely that a person simultaneously possessing the omni properties exists. So it's not trying to say it's absolutely impossible. It's just trying to say it's very unlikely, given the amount of evil and suffering. And that there's very specific types of cases that philosophers who are writing about this think about. They start off with this kind of factual premise: there exist numerous instances of intense suffering. And by the way, William Rowe is a contemporary philosopher most famous for developing this argument. And his version of it is what philosophers have been writing about for 20 or 30 years now. And the kind of examples he gives are things like there's forest fires, and you have an animal like a deer gets trapped in it, and it slowly dies this horrible death, being burned alive. Horrible stuff like that. Or think about the worst atrocities. I won't go into detail, but think about, you just watch a true crime show and you can see how horrendously evil and terrible people can be to each other. The type of abuse and such. Well, William Rowe and others look at those cases and they go, these are like intense levels of suffering that are happening. Horrible things happening. And we can just the almost exponential level, because these are just two examples, but you can start pointing to all sorts of these things. And it's really hard to think of a reason why. Like, why would this go on? And so they point at that fact and they want to say, well, if God is all-powerful and has all the knowledge, and he could have prevented these things because he's all-powerful and he has all the knowledge, and if he's perfectly good, that means he would want to prevent these things. So he has the means to prevent them and a desire, he wants to, but he's not. Well, that seems odd if he's real. So we think this makes it unlikely that there's a person who's invisible who has all these maximal power properties that we're talking about. So that gives you an overview of the contemporary argument for atheism. It starts off with premise one, assuming that Bab model of God, the being among beings view. And then premise two is where all the action is. That's where all of this debate and all these clever, sophisticated arguments trying to prove that premise, that there cannot be. Either it's impossible for there to be, or it's highly unlikely that there's a being like that. And that's where things have been in philosophy, and that trickles down at the popular level. That is the type of stuff you see people debating. And I hinted at that at the beginning when I was talking about the Bab model. That's the kind of stuff you see people like Richard Dawkins doing. That's the kind of stuff you see your average YouTube channel. I'm kind of weird. I like to go on and just follow various YouTube channels and Instagram channels of people who are atheists and such, and just kind of see what they're doing, because I find it fascinating. And this is where it's at. This is what everyone's talking about. So both at the academic and popular level. Now, it's funny to me that no one has really spent much time thinking about that first premise. That's just kind of gone without being challenged. But it takes both of those premises for the argument to work. If you want to prove the conclusion, which is that God doesn't exist, you need both of those premises, not just premise 2. So where everyone else has been focusing on premise 2, and believe me, you have lots of very talented, sophisticated Christian thinkers who have written papers on each of those arguments I just talked about tonight. I could find, probably hundreds of papers of people picking them apart, trying to say Christian philosophers or Islamic philosophers, Jewish philosophers going, yeah, this argument doesn't work, let me show why, and then atheist philosophers publishing their papers. So you could get down lost in a rabbit hole, and we could go into that minutia. Same for the paradox of the stone, same for the other. All these arguments have a lot of writing, because everyone's focused on that premise 2. But I think it's funny that no one really thinks much about premise 1. Everyone just assumes that that's true. Yet there's not really been any kind of defense of that at all. So that's what I want to challenge tonight. That's what I have challenged in my own academic writing. And in the book that I am basing this off of, I want to challenge that first premise. I think the first premise is false. And I think any Orthodox Christian should think that. Hopefully, just giving you that little sample of Orthodox thinking about God, this beyond being model, has shown you that that's not how Orthodox Christians have ever conceived or thought about God. The Orthodox Church has never thought of God as some kind of superpowered Zeus-like figure, some being among beings, some natural kind of cause for the physical universe, anything like that. Rather, we've always thought about God as being the source of things, the ground and explanation of things, but beyond all things. We've thought of God as not being a class or a type of thing, but as being transcendent. So if we accept the BB model and reject this BABA model, in a funny turn of a twist of events, we actually agree a lot with the atheists. We're right. We don't believe that there's a God like that. We don't believe in the existence of that God. We reject that BAB model. We reject the idea that God is in a class of things. We reject the idea that God can be defined, that we can know his essence, what he is. We reject this idea that defining God as an essentially composed of these kind of properties, these maximal properties, these omni properties. So we reject this whole model of God. And we agree that it's not coherent. We agree that it's a bad way of thinking about God. In fact, you can find lots of examples in patristic writers that critique over anthropomorphizing God. It's very common, like if you read St. Maximus or St. Grave of Nyssa, they'll talk about the dangers of reading the Old Testament and reading it in this literal way according to the letter of the law. That's the wording they use. They borrow that from St. Paul, talking about reading it in this way in which it seems like God is like how Richard Dawkins described in the beginning, this horrible, maniacal, terrible, conniving, scheming, jealous, right, person with maximal kind of power and knowledge. But we don't think of God that way. God's the source of being, but beyond being. So here's some conclusions we can draw from what I've just gone through. If that Orthodox Christians are correct in thinking about God, if we accept the beyond being model of God, then all of those type A, type B, type C arguments are unsound. We don't have to get lost in the minutia of debating about premise 2. We could just deny premise 1 of the argument and say it's not a sound argument. It does not support the conclusion. It doesn't succeed. And that's because we don't accept that model of God. Orthodox Christians who embrace the BB model of God are not vulnerable to arguments of this type. Thus, for Orthodox Christians, the contemporary arguments for atheism do not provide rational justification for atheism. Hence, it is unclear that the contemporary arguments for atheism provide good reasons for an Orthodox Christian to embrace positive atheism.